Matt Shepard was a student at the University of Wyoming. By all accounts, a very bright, talented music student, active in clubs, popular on campus, but he had a problem. He was gay. One evening, he went to a local bar, and two men lured him into their pickup truck, and while they were traveling around town, beat him savagely. They proceeded out of town and down a dirt road, and while they were there, they took him out, stripped him down, and tied him to a fence post and pistol whipped him, and left him in the 30-degree winter air. 18 hours later, a young man, Ernie Beal, was out for a solo bike ride along that mountain way. The weather was unpleasant, and he almost turned back to go back to the north several times. He doesn't really know what or why or how he continued on, but he did. And ultimately, as he pedaled up that path, crooked and difficult, his bike hit a rock. He was pitched forward, and he landed on his head. Now, he happened to land just a few feet from where Matt Shepard stood tied to the fence post. And when he saw Shepard, he ran miles to the nearest phone to call in Matt's troubles. Now, Aaron didn't say anything to anyone about his act of grace. Things on the University of Wyoming campus were difficult for folks who are gay. And so Aaron kept it a secret until after the assailants were caught and convicted. Ironically, Matt was taken to a hospital and put into a room next door to one of the assailants, who had himself become injured in another bar fight. Matt died 4 days later. Tragic though his death was, that's not the end of the story. His death, of course, generated substantial national media attention. The circumstance is brutal, and it is a form of terrorism. Amidst the fury, the homecoming parade took place in Matt's university town. On the lead float in that, someone took a sign and put a scarecrow that said, "I'm a fag." As the community prepared to mourn his death, a pastor at a church in Topeka, Kansas decided that this was bad. Here was a reprehensible young man who was a sinner. And so he persuaded his congregation and urged his congregation to protest Matt's funeral. And of course, the city council, knowing that this was going to happen, passed an ordinance that said, no, you can't protest at anybody's funerals. But that didn't stop Pastor Phelps. No, Pastor Phelps and his flock were there, according to news accounts, with signs like, "No tears for queers," and "God hates fags." And it would be nice to to say that Pastor Phelps represents an anomaly within the religious community, but we know, as practicing Christians and as people who read this newspaper, that he is not. You know, the United States Department of the Federal Bureau of Investigation has been gathering statistics on hate crimes as a result of a federal statute since the mid-1990s. Acts of hate crime perpetrated against folks who are gay exceed 1,000 a year. Quite interestingly, in doing a book about a particular episode, the drowning of Stephen, the author interviewed 400 men who were in prison for gay bashing. Most said that they saw nothing morally wrong with what they'd done. Many said that their religion dictated that what they had read in the Bible spoke to the question of homosexuality unambiguously. I wish that were true, but it doesn't speak quite so unambiguously. The Bible speaks to a lot of subjects. It addresses the question of homosexuality only in 7 passages, amidst thousands of pieces of text, multiple references to the importance of seeking justice, siding with the poor, the disadvantaged, and the excluded. 4 of those passages deal with the practice of men taking young boys in exploitive sexual relationships, something that was quite common at the time. That leaves only 3 references to sexuality, to homosexual practice. And it doesn't deal with homosexuality. It deals with propagation of the race. Now there's one passage in Leviticus. There are 2 passages in the letters of Paul. And our question always as biblical people is, how do we put those things in context? You know, do we read the Bible literally? Some people will say they read the Bible literally. And I think that's probably not true. You know, the Bible does speak to sexual practices in a number of places. You know, for example, Deuteronomy 22:13-21 says that if a bride's not a virgin, she's to be stoned to death on the spot. Deuteronomy 22:22 says if a married person has sex with someone else's husband or wife, both adulterers are to be put to death. Mark 10:1-12 specifically forbids divorce. Leviticus 18, verse 19, says that married couples are not to have any form of intercourse during the menstrual period. More interestingly, Mark, in chapter 12, verses 18-27, says that when a woman's husband dies, the woman is under a duty to sleep with her husband's brothers until she bears a child. Now, the Bible also does have some other more permissive things. It says, for example, that men may sleep with prostitutes, but women should not. Now, most of us in a contemporary context would look at those words and say, no way. No way do those words written 3,000 years ago speak to our culture. We are a more enlightened, more knowledgeable, more careful people. but we're not less faithful. Now it's interesting because the Bible is not a book about sex. It's a book about faith. And it's a book about the discipline of being good Christians, especially the sections in the New Testament. And Paul, who is the primary source of any language on sexuality, isn't somebody we look to for guidance about our personal conduct in the course of the church. He may have some great things to say about faith, but on the other hand, he says very explicitly that none of you women, none of you should ever speak in church. He says very explicitly that this practice of running around and dressing up for church, especially fancy headgear, is absolutely forbidden. It's an abomination. Paul also says, as does Leviticus and Deuteronomy, that it's good to have slaves. And slaves should obey their masters. Now what we understand is, and certainly people use that kind of language, it was used to support slavery in this country, spoken and preached in the churches of the South. But the reality is we know better today. We know something about good Christian practice that says to us that slavery is wrong and that women are welcome. We've learned something along the way that makes us better people. So how do we deal with this biblical text? In some ways, I would love it if we were all literalists. You know, and the Bible says, for example, that all of you who are in commercial activities are supposed to give up your debts every 7 years. I'd love to have all of my loans, credit cards, and the like forgiven once every 7 years. I'd spend myself silly, perhaps. Now, the other thing it also says, why done ambiguously, is all of you are supposed to give 10% of your income to the church. And we certainly wouldn't have a budget problem if you were all literalists. Bottom line is, when we read the text, we read it not through its words, we read it through our own lenses. We select and deselect what we want out of the text to fill some purpose, to meet some need, and occasionally to satisfy